Welcome back to Basics. So this episode we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be staying in the Kerbin system, and I'm going to do something I've never done before, which is I'm going to use the ISIU add-ons, which is all the mining equipment. We're going to go to Minmus and we're going to do some mining. So yeah, I've not done this before. It's a new thing that's been added in the last few years, so let's see what happens. Please join me. Right, you find me in the VAB, and as you saw at the start there, I'm just putting together a satellite, because one of the big things you have to do with mining is actually identify where you need to mine. So you can see on the top there we've got the big scanner, and I've put that on, and I played around a bit with the design of this craft. It's going to just be a standard liquid fueled satellite, and I've got plenty of Delta V on it. But I also noticed that we have, because we've unlocked all the tech, we've actually got ion drive. So I thought, well, why don't we try that? They use a bit of electricity, but so does this satellite when you're actually using it. So I thought, that's not such a bad problem. So I put together an ion probe as well. Now, ion gives you a lot of ISP, so you can pretty much go almost anywhere with it. But sometimes it's not actually that practical, because particularly for this, we're potentially not going to need a lot of Delta V. But I thought, let's give it a go, because I haven't used the ion drives for a long, or the xenon drives for a long time. So let's see what happens. So both of them are launching on our old favorite sort of rocket, slight modifications. We don't have a nuclear in middle stage. We just have the solid rocket first stage and a liquid fuel second stage. And it's a standard sort of launch profile. I put them both beside each other so you can see it. And we're just sending off one in the daytime, one at night. Again, it doesn't matter if you're doing something like this, you're going into an equatorial orbit, it doesn't matter, and one of them did a little flip with aerodynamic issues. It doesn't matter what time of day you're actually going to launch. I normally try and launch in the daytime just because it looks nicer, but if you get your planet shine and things like that on, you can see just as well in the dark as you can see from this. So there you go, unfold them, and you can actually see both of the craft there. They're pretty much on the same transfer stage. We've got quite a lot of Delta V left in, and there they are. They're very similar, with just their propulsion systems really being different. I've actually got more solar panels on the craft that doesn't really need them, but that's mainly because it's just a bigger craft. You can actually see it has a lot of fuel on board for its size. So I'm going to show you just a standard Minmus transfer there. We just play around with the nodes. I really wanted to do the transfer around the ascending or descending node, just because then I don't have to do a plane change. In the end, I did do a little bit of plane changing, but nothing major. What we're actually trying to do is send these into a polar orbit, because for the scans, the KerbNet or scanning satellite or whatever you want to call it, to work effectively, you want to be in a polar orbit that allows it to cover the surface as the planet or body underneath it rotates. And this is true with most satellites that do any sort of scanning. So a lot of the sort of oceanographic satellites, the ones that do scanning of the surface of planets on Earth and actually the Moon and other planetary bodies, will go into ideally polar orbits or highly inclined orbits. The idea that you get to cover more of the planet. If you were just in an equatorial orbit, you're only going to scan what's underneath you. Everything else is going to be at a funny angle, so you don't actually scan that much. A lot of probes will actually not go into full polar orbit, because you end up getting a lot of coverage of the poles and you don't really need to scan that. If you're actually mapping something, you normally go into a slightly sort of 70-degree inclined orbit, 80-degree inclined orbit. You don't need to go the full 90. So once we've actually got our satellites and they're on their way, we've left them on their way to Minmus, I decided to build the craft for mining. Now you see, why am I putting a claw on the top of this? Well, I could put a docking port on, and I do actually put one on at the bottom later, but the big problem we have is we've got multiple different sorts of docking port, and I am not sure what's happening with this save, where the next steps are. So I actually put a claw on because it allows us to attach to any craft. So you can see here I've got standard sort of crew cabin at the top there, and then we've got a storage tank there for the ore. Below that we've got a converter, and then we've got 2 drills. I did think about using nuclear engines for this. I decided against it, mainly because you're always going to have an excess of oxidizer because you're going to be doing these conversions and whatnot. And I thought, you know what, let's just go with a nice engine that lets us land easily. This craft will be doing the transfer itself, so it's got to have enough fuel for its transfer. Once it's done that and it's at Minmus, it can refuel, it can do that. And my vision for this sort of craft is I would probably build a craft that just goes down to the surface, mines, cleans it up, brings it up, and fuels up our orbital craft. You don't want to really be bringing all your craft down to the surface just to refuel. It's cumbersome and it uses excess fuel up. You can see there I put on some thermal control panels. Now, I have not used those before. I don't really fully understand them yet, and it's something I really need to get into sort of understanding. They all have a rated sort of wattage of energy sort of dissipation and thermal dispensation and stuff like that. So I need to get that, but if we stuck a few on there, I'm sure you could perfect this. You'll see I put these solar panels on semi-oriented, so there's two on each side in a slight sort of paired way. So this launch vehicle is basically 3 solid rocket motors, and it is chunky. It has a lot of air resistance, and you'll see the solid boosters actually got very hot because of it. And there we go. We've boosted up this craft just into semi-Kerbin orbit. It's a suborbital hopper. It can finish the orbital insertion itself, and then it should have more than enough delta V to get to Minmus and start mining. And that's the hope anyway. Again, what you could do is actually put another stage on it and really reduce the size of those side tanks. But in my head, this craft is going to be going to Minmus, and then it's going to be filling itself up with fuel and then transferring that fuel in orbit to other craft. Now, there are other ways of doing this. You could send a craft down that is purely there for mining. So you have some small fuel tanks enough to land and take off from Minmus, and a big ore tank on it, and then you don't have to take down the converter and all of these things. You just take down a couple of drills, you fill up with ore, go up into orbit, and do the conversion in orbit as you need it. And that's something that, you know, I would be tempted to do, but for Minmus, it's light gravity, and carrying the extra converter and stuff is not a big issue. Alternatively, you could actually have a base on Minmus that does all of this digging and purifying and converting of ore, and then you just put a tanker down next to it. And again, what you could do is actually have a little transport tanker, a little bit like a petrol wagon, a petrol truck, an oil truck, with a claw on the end of it, and you can go backwards and forwards between your base and the craft that's landed. Or you could try doing something clever with docking ports and robotic arms and things, but again, that would require some really quite accurate landing. And while I can be good at times, sometimes, you know, you can't guarantee it. So you got to build in a little bit of something, otherwise you end up with craft just absolutely everywhere. So we go back to our satellites, which are now coming into the sphere of influence of Minmus, and it's literally just a case of putting them into polar orbits. They came in at random inclinations, at random distances. They were actually quite a distance away, some of them. If you try and do a scan for resources and you're not in the right orbit, it will tell you, and it will tell you what orbit it expects. It expects a certain range of altitude in your orbit, and that it be polar. I'm not sure as to what degree inclination that can go, but I think on these we were out by a couple of degrees, and it was fine. As I say, in the real world, you wouldn't put something like this into a purely polar orbit because, well, you've normally got a scanning width, and that scanning width would normally cover the poles even when it's not in a polar orbit. Also, sometimes people just don't scan poles. You know, it's hard to land at the poles, so or even high latitudes and latitudes it is, yes. But so you often don't scan it. Apollo missions and so forth, they tended to land near the equator, just because it meant returning to orbit and rendezvousing was just easier. And that's what you tend to find. So both of these craft are now basically pulling down into this polar sets of orbits, and you can see on the chart on the map of Minmus, you can actually see them there, and we can see the scan there as well. So you can see these lovely coloured areas, and almost the entirety of Minmus is coloured. You can go in and you can change the sensitivity, and I figured that out later. I think you can actually go in and change on the scanner the sensitivity, and then that shows you the richest areas, the highest percentages. But again, this is just a little trial run of mine, and just seeing this stuff work. I have used mods 5, 6, 7 years ago that would do stuff like this, and the more recent ones, things like Interstellar Quest and things like ISRU mods and things like that, they all do different things, but basically the same principle, which is you have a satellite that's going to do some scanning, and then you're going to send a mining team down and do stuff. The actual stock system does reward you for using bigger drills and things like that, not just in the time it takes to get things, but actually in the amount that you can get as well. I'm not sure if the ores run out over time. That'd be quite interesting, and if somebody wants to comment on that, I'm not entirely sure of it. So our mining craft is now coming in. It now has an idea of what it wants to do, and unlike the satellites, it's not going to come in polar. We could, because conceivably once we've landed, we can then go into, if we land on the equator, we can go into any orbit we want, but I want to bring it into a sort of somewhat of an equatorial orbit. So it's actually coming inclined, and we're going to change that around the equator, and it doesn't have to be perfectly on the equator, but we want to be sort of semi like that, because we're trying to imagine that we might actually want to refuel craft in orbit. And you can see we've got quite a lot of fuel left. We've emptied our tanks, but remember, we're going to be bringing fuel back up, and if those tanks were full now and we were using it all landing, there'd be no point actually sending this craft down. So in reality, what I would actually probably do is just stick a tiny ore tank on this, and then have bigger fuel tanks. It's also got extra monopropellant, just because, well, we can make it, so it's easy. At this point, I start to notice that the place, this butterfly sort of flat that I'm coming down in, has something else in it. If you actually see around here, I'm looking down, I start to see on the ground there, I see something. It's not on the map on this screen, and I start to wonder what it is. And so I pull on the flag symbol and realize it is actually our landing site for our first ever landing on Minmus. And at that point, it opens up that little challenge of, can I go and visit my first landing site? And that's what I start to do. So although I'm running out of fuel, I start to actually try and see if I can land somewhere near it. Now, Minmus rotates more quickly than most planetary bodies. Actually, it's got a very high rate of rotation. You can actually see this here as I'm dropping down. It's actually moved along. So originally I was going to land, if it had stayed still, I was going to land on top of that flag. But in the time that it took for me to fall, 2-3 kilometers under Minmus's weak gravity, it moved. And you do have to take that into account whenever you're doing any sort of landing on a body and you're trying to put things near each other. Again, another reason why trying to actually have sort of rendezvous on surface is, with spacecraft in particular, is difficult. You see here, I'm now I use my RCS because I know I'm actually going to be able to refill it, just to push me sideways, because I can. And I also saw another thing there and realised that there was something else on the planet that I could see, and that was actually on the other side of the planet. It's about 80 kilometres on the other side, so we're not getting anywhere near that. So we're coming in, and this is one of the messiest landings, because I'm basically trying to drift as close to that flag as possible. I do actually get worried at one point that I might, if I actually land near it, am I going to knock it over? So I stop myself from being a bit too accurate. As long as you're within, the render range has changed. It used to be, I think, 1.2 kilometers. If you were within 1.2 kilometers or 1.5 kilometers or 2 kilometers, you'd have things rendered. Obviously, we can see this flag is here, and we're bringing our craft down ever so gently. And in my head, I've done a little bit of maths. I'm going, okay, I'm within, Pythagoras, the angle I'm coming down at, the height I'm within 100 meters of this. I'm quite happy. And then it vanishes because we're close enough. I think that means we're probably within 100 meters. It stops showing it. However, flags are very small. So I'm actually looking around at this point as I'm coming into land, thinking, has something happened? What's going on? And we're down. And the irony is, I've actually, at this point, forgotten about why I'm here. I'm just like, I could go and visit my flag again. Won't that be great? So we get out our pilot, and we don't have any ladders because we don't need them because we're on Minmus. However, what I forgot was that I've actually extended the thermal system, and that is right underneath where he is. So I start to think about, I could put my jetpack on and I could jetpack down, and just in time, I remembered which buttons. For some reason, I have like a black hole for remembering which button triggers the jetpack to go up. I know that I can activate it like RCS, but I just forget about what is the sort of up button. I always want to use the docking controls almost for it. I must actually check that you can't. I might see if I can remap that to the docking controls, because it just seems a bit more natural to me. So of course we're on Minmus, and everything is slow in Minmus. So we look around, and yeah, I spent a little while trying to find it until, you know, I figured out my orientation, and then we do some falling around. Yeah, this is not making me look good at all, is it? Yeah. Get the jetpack up, and I can see something. I can see a speck on the horizon, I think. And I head towards it, and then realise that actually I've just gone past the flag. Yeah. So there it is. You can see the flag really does blend into the background there. They're actually very small. It would probably be easier if I'd have left something beside it, like a science station. I know we've got science stations on Minmus, we've got science stations on the moon. It would have been great to leave something bigger there so that I could actually see it. But this is our first flag, our first landing site on Minmus, which I think is really quite cool as we're coming towards the end of our second season now. And yes, this is coming towards the end of the second season. Of course, you know, there are plans afoot to return to the moon and things like that. And there's talk of, we could go and visit the landing sites of previous visits. Obviously, if we went to the moon, and in Minmus, in fact, the flag would not look like that. These materials are unprotected from the solar radiation, the UV light, and things like that. As such, most of the flags that are on the moon will probably be completely bleached by now. This flag would probably be bleached by now, because we were looking at 7-8 years of just intense, you know, sunlight beating down. It would definitely have changed. Also, a number of the flags were actually knocked over when the descent, the ascent engines fired, because they were placed too close to the base of the craft. So anyway, we go back to the actual reason we're here, which is to get ore and make stuff. And you can deploy your drills, and they do all these things. And the one thing I did learn from this, now, you know, if you're ever in doubt, I put the drills on, and it's slow. But also, you've got to make sure you've got to not only just deploy the drills, you've actually got to activate them first, you know, taking surface ore. Yeah, this is slow, very slow. So I just ran it, just fast forwarded it a bit to see if we could actually get anything from this craft. So we did get fuel. We were getting fuel building up, and that was a positive. Again, if you were doing this, if you have a base on the surface, or a crew on the surface, or something that can stay on the surface and just mine non-stop and put it into storage tanks, that'd be brilliant. There we go. We've got our scientist. I think he's actually an engineer. Yeah, he's our engineer. He's just sat there. He's enjoying himself, and he's just gonna let it drill away. I must say, I think the animations of those drills are quite good. Some of the earlier mods that came out with these things were you know, outgassing and things like that. But yeah, so I think we're gonna leave it there. So until next time, have a great one.